is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Global Business Europe, live from CGTN in London. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Biden steps up to the plate to defend his presidency ahead of a midnight deadline to avert a government shutdown.
Our other headlines: the final furlough. UK travel and hospitality sectors warn of tough times ahead as pandemic job protection comes to a close.
Youth climate activists pile the pressure on world leaders to act faster on tackling global warming.
Former French President Sarkozy is sentenced over illegal campaign financing, but he's unlikely to go to jail.
And plain sailing. The world's largest amphibious aircraft goes on display at China's air show.
It looks as if an imminent shutdown of the United States government may have been averted, at least for now.
But there's more trouble ahead on the funding front, and Joe Biden's signature infrastructure policy is still very much hanging in the balance.
CGTN's John Terrett is in New York for us. John, first, let's talk about this US government shutdown.
Yeah, let me tell you as well that stocks here have been declining in the last hour or so after early gains for the reasons that I'm now going to outline. And I think you should bear in mind there are three things are going on in the Congress in Washington, D.C. today, all of which are very important and all of which could have an effect on this stock market here. Now, the first of them is a new government spending bill, and there's a deadline for that. If they couldn't agree to that, then there would have been basically a government shutdown here. And the deadline is at 04 GMT on Friday, which is 5 a.m. with you guys, 6 a.m. in Paris, midday in Beijing, and of course midnight here in New York and in Washington, D.C. Now, it does look as if the imminent government shutdown has now been averted. Nancy Pelosi, who's the Speaker of the House, has just been giving remarks, and she says that a stopgap measure is in place. And Mitch McConnell, who's the minority leader in the Senate, says that a bill will go through, shutdown avoided. So how have they done that? Well, what's happened is Republicans and Democrats have actually, rather unusually, I think, actually got together, and they've come up with a deal to fund new government spending through December the 3rd. So you have to bear that date in mind, December the 3rd. It's only 3 months away, which means we'll be back here having exactly the same conversations in 3 months' time. And the reason they've agreed is that there's money in this new spending bill for Afghan refugees coming here and also for the terrible weather repairs that we've had. So things like wildfires and tornadoes and hurricanes. And of course, the politicians are very mindful of the midterm elections, which is when many of them will be up for re-election. That's only a year in this November, and campaigning for that starts on the 1st of January 2022. So they have one eye on all of that. But for those reasons, at least the imminent shutdown of the US government regarding spending has gone away, we think, for now. But I'll tell you one thing, they will go to the 59th minute of the 11th hour before they actually finally say that they've agreed. So we're in for a long day, guys.
OK, let's put that aside, John. What about the infrastructure bill?
Well, this is the other very big thing. Now, this is the hot and happening thing of the moment, and we are going to be talking about this over the course of the next couple of hours or so, probably the next 12 hours. It looks as if there's going to be a vote on a $1.1 trillion, what we call hard infrastructure bill. OK, so that's roads and bridges, that sort of thing. However, as you know, the Democratic Party, led by Joe Biden, doesn't have a big majority in the House or the Senate. And progressives, the left wing of his party, are very, very keen, and they say they will vote down this bill, even though it would provide $1.1 trillion of infrastructure and lots of jobs and stuff like that. The progressives promised to vote it down because they want a much bigger one, which is out there, worth $3.5 trillion. And this brings in things like social spending and climate change money and parental care when you have a baby, all that sort of thing. And they want to do this because they know time is running out because the elections are coming up. Now, moderate Democrats, not progressives, moderates, people like Joe Manchin, who is the former governor of West Virginia, now the senator for West Virginia, and Kirsten Sinema, who is a senator in Arizona. They think spending $3.5 trillion at this time is just crazy and mad, and they will not vote in favor for it. Now, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, where this $1.1 trillion vote comes up today, has said that she won't bring a vote if it's going to fail. She's just said that they will have a reconciliation bill, which means they'll pull all the ideas together into some kind of bill that won't be 3.5, but won't be 1.1 either. However, if she could have called a vote, she would have called a vote, so that means she doesn't have the numbers in place at the moment. And just finally, on this issue, you have to remember this is Joe Biden's big issue. This is his signature thing, to do infrastructure and get jobs going and to repair all those things in America that need to be repaired. And he's working the phones like crazy. He cancelled a trip to Chicago this week to stay in Washington, D.C. And last night he even went to a congressional baseball game where he was handing out candy in the dugout among the players, talking to members of Congress, cajoling them, trying to get them on board.
John, in the background to all of this, the debt ceiling, what's going on with that?
Well, this is the third thing, and of all the things I've spoken about, this is really the most serious, because the debt ceiling deals with money that the government has already spent, so it's gone. It's out of the account, and this is another chance for the country to come to a stop. This will be on the 18th of October, when at that point the country runs out of money. In the House Financial Services Committee meeting going on at the moment, Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, has said not raising the debt ceiling would be a catastrophe. Only Congress can do that. They put a moratorium in a couple of years ago at $22 trillion. It's now at $28 trillion. They need to either raise it or have another moratorium. If they don't, workers will be furloughed, buildings closed, parks closed, all that sort of thing. Most worryingly, the U.S. will not be able to pay its obligations on its bonds. Now, it's never happened. And the credibility of the United States will be so damaged that these people don't think it will happen. But it's another key issue on the table in the Congress right now.
John Terrace in New York, thank you very much.
The biggest state intervention in the UK labour market in peacetime has come to an end as the government's coronavirus jobs subsidy programme, known as furlough, winds up.
The calls are growing to target help at badly affected sectors such as hospitality and travel. Juliet Mann reports.
This is all you can't go even if you want to go to. This is still pretty much red list.
Travel inquiries are coming in, but it's a voyage of recovery.
We had our best week last week, but that's getting us back to about 40% of our normal level. It's still nowhere near enough to be able to trade profitably. We need help over the coming 6 months, certainly through the winter period, to hopefully get things back to more like normality next year.
The end of the furlough wage subsidy for pandemic-hit businesses means this firm has compromised. To save their jobs, all 6 staff have dropped to a 4-day week. The landlord's been understanding on the rent.
You can't future-proof or deal with something where your income goes overnight from 100% to practically zero and remains that way for 14, 15 months. We would have been able to survive without furlough, but we would not have been able to survive with keeping the majority of our staff employed. And we would have lost people who've been with us probably 15, 20 years. So it's allowed us to keep particularly a talent pool within the industry and not lose it.
Think tanks say furlough prevented catastrophic levels of unemployment by supporting 11.6 million workers and subsidising 2.3 billion working days. The cost to the state was about $96 billion.
There's no question that this was absolutely essential. The real question now is what happens next. And it comes at a rough time for the UK economy. There's a confluence of factors, not just the end of the furlough scheme. There's a cut to universal credit around the corner. There's also the surge in gas prices and general concerns around inflation.
Retailers are rationalising. This was one of 81 UK Gap stores now closing down, affecting some 1,000 employees. Official forecasts throughout the pandemic predicted unemployment to rise after the end of furlough. But the Bank of England says the UK labour market is hard to read. There may be record vacancies for jobs like chefs, lorry drivers, care assistants and fruit pickers. but those skill sets don't necessarily match up with those of people coming off furlough. That's why industry groups want to see the scheme retained as a permanent option when economies hit crisis point. But market watchers have a keen eye on infection rates. If a spike necessitates another lockdown, the government will be under pressure to bring furlough back. Juliet Mann, CGTN, London.
Day 6 of a severe fuel crunch that has caused chaos for British drivers. The government claims the situation is improving, but many pumps across the country remain closed, leaving motorists queuing for hours to fill their tanks. Well, our correspondent Andrew Wilson is following the story. So, Andrew, ministers are saying the crisis is easing, but is it?
Well, if you look at the figures, let's deal with the good news first of all. Whitehall, the government analysis puts the country into a traffic light system, green, amber and red. On Sunday, the entire UK was red. In other words, a petrol crisis up and down from John O'Groats to Land's End. Only Northern Ireland was green. They've had no problems in Northern Ireland. The picture today now is that swathes of the country are now amber. Scotland, particularly the northeast, Wales and the southwest. But still, London and the major cities, Birmingham, Manchester, up to Liverpool, they are still apparently in crisis. The Petrol Retailers Association says that on Sunday, about 2/3 of the country's petrol stations were dry, without fuel. That's about 8,500. Yesterday, it was about a quarter. Today, they're saying about 2,000 petrol stations are dry today. That's still about a quarter. So why is this happening? If there's no fuel crisis and the government has started adding some of its own trucks to the fleet, and indeed some of the troops from the army are now, we believe, being deployed, why are there still problems in the petrol stations? And it's because social media now has put out the feelers, and every time a tanker delivers to a station, it goes out on social media and worried drivers turn up in their droves to fill up their cars. There's a problem now with the public trusting this plan of the government's to allow things to ease off. So even if things are easing off in terms of deliveries, the buying is continuing in much larger numbers than usual, and it's tipping petrol stations over their normal balance. A petrol station runs at about 40% full in unusual circumstances. The petrol stations that are running at about 20% now, and that's quickly being sucked dry by drivers turning up in their droves.
And we're also seeing gas prices hitting new highs, while more companies in the UK are going out of business. Will we be seeing more of the same?
Well, that's a good question as well. Obviously, the big six gas and energy companies, British Gas, Scottish Power and the rest of it, E.ON, they're all going to remain solid. However, there's a whole raft of smaller energy companies that have come in and in the last few years offering big discounts and often green energy rather than gas or petroleum energy to try and take their place in the market. These are the ones that are suffering. Today, Igloo Energy, Symbio and Estroga went bust today. Now, they're not particularly big companies. Maybe Estroga's 40,000 clients. They go up to about 250,000 clients. But 12 of these companies have now gone bust in the past year. That's about 2 million households having to switch suddenly to a different supplier for their gas and not being able to negotiate the price of that gas either. It's an automatic process. So that's flagging up concerns about how bad this winter is going to be for low-income households. And there is talk about unpredictable price hikes, people perhaps turning off appliances, turning off their freezers and fridges, wrapping in blankets rather than using the heating. So that's a level of concern. Now, to go back to our other story, the other level of concern about drivers delivering fuel to gas stations, well, now that concern about drivers has been echoed by the Farmers Union, by the supermarkets, by the construction industry, by wider agriculture, all saying they're concerned that there aren't enough truckers for them to go about their business. The Farmers Union now says there are something like 150,000 pigs that have reached maturity, but there are no butchers to deal with them and put them onto the supermarket shelves, and so they may have to be slaughtered because they're now causing a health problem within the farms. And this all boils down to there aren't enough people to do those jobs. These are all jobs that were done by people from Europe, and so there's pressure on the government to start issuing more part-time work visas for Europeans to come back and help with this crisis, and it's been lumped together with the gas crisis to make the public very nervous about the prospects for November, December and January 2021 going into 22 as well.
Andrew Wilson, thanks very much.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, unprecedented action by Uber in Brussels as the ride-hailing giant suspends its service in support of its drivers.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to the Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London. Who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link, only on CGTN. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. A quick reminder for you that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Hundreds of climate activists protesting against the inaction of world leaders have clashed with the police in Milan.
The scuffles broke out near the venue where young climate activists, including Sweden's Greta Thunberg, as well as climate ministers, have been meeting to lay the groundwork for the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow. Activists are demanding policymakers pay up the billions of dollars needed to wean the world off fossil fuels.
Well, CGTN's correspondent Giles Gibson is covering the summit from Brussels and joins us now. What are climate activists in Milan telling world leaders?
Well, Greta Thunberg and 2 other young climate activists actually had a meeting in person with Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi. That meeting was behind closed doors, but earlier in the week we saw Greta Thunberg mocking politicians for the way that they talk about climate change, saying that there's been 30 years of blah, blah, blah. We've also had some proposals put forward by the Youth for Climate conference that they want included in the actual COP26 climate change conference coming up in Glasgow in November. One of those proposals is that the fossil fuel industry should be phased out by 2030, so in, 8 or 9 years from now, which is much, much earlier than we've seen proposed by other governments around the world.
Saying to you is we can turn this thing around, and there are 4 things that we want to come out of COP26, 4 big changes in our approach, and it's very easy to remember. It's coal, cars, cash and trees.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson speaking earlier. Giles, what are climate ministers focusing on at this pre-COP summit?
Well, climate financing, Jamie, is expected to really dominate the pre-COP talks that are going on in the next couple of days in the Italian city of Milan. Wealthy nations have proposed or have pledged in the past to provide $100 billion worth of climate financing to developing nations to help them respond to climate change. But, Jamie, so far they have simply just not lived up to those pledges. So that's really what we've been hearing a lot from climate activists in Milan, is just pushing world leaders to deliver not just slogans, as we saw from Boris Johnson there, but actually concrete agreements once they meet in Glasgow in about 4 or 5 weeks' time.
Giles Gibson in Brussels, thank you very much.
Elizabeth Wathuti is a Kenyan environmentalist. She's also the founder of the Green Generation Initiative, which encourages young people to love nature. Elizabeth is also one of the delegates at the Youth Climate Summit in Milan. I asked her how successful young people have been in getting their message across.
What is going to determine if we were actually being listened to is if the proposals that we have made today are actually going to be implemented, that we are going to see these things happening at COP26 and beyond. And one of the really most important things we want to begin seeing is what is changing right now. Because many other times we hold conferences and what leaders are telling us is about what they want to do or what they've been doing, but we want to hear what is happening right now. What are the key things that they're pledging to do right now? Because the climate crisis is still affecting the most vulnerable people. And the more we continue to delay the action, the more these people continue facing most of the loss and damage that we don't even talk about.
So has meeting in Milan and sharing ideas helped you have a clearer picture of what you might want to say to COP26 in Glasgow?
Yes, we really want to see the massive gaps in what's needed and what is actually being done right now being bridged, because we are so far away from what needs to be done. And according to the latest IPCC science report and also the rising and escalating impacts of the climate crisis in countries like mine, from droughts being declared a national disaster to countries where people and communities have to face the loss of lives and livelihoods from their homes, being washed away by the floods. This is a red alert that we actually need to take the IPCC report as the last warning, and we need to begin taking urgent action and begin to treat the climate crisis like the crisis that it is. And this is only going to be made possible if the proposals that we made today of including the people that are the most vulnerable especially, and also making sure that we are not leaving anyone behind, and making sure that also the issue of loss and damage. If countries are not reducing emissions and not supporting those countries that are the most affected, then we are going to face a lot of loss and damage moving forward. So these things are only going to be possible if we begin to address the issues right now and not delay any action.
So how confident are you that the urgent action you say we need will start to be taken at COP26?
According to what is happening right now and the things that we are seeing, I'm really not certain that things are beginning to change, because we are pretty much just speeding towards the wrong direction. And this is only visible because the impacts of climate change keep on escalating every other day. And also from the latest IPCC science report, it shows that we have wasted so many years that we would have used to take up urgent action. And what is really alarming for me as a young person is that every decision that is going to be made today is going to affect us greatly, and we are the generation that will have to live longer with the consequences of the world's inaction and the consequences of the wrong actions from the leaders today.
China's factory activity has shrunk unexpectedly in September. The official Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index was at 49.6. Any figure below 50 marks a contraction. And this is the first contraction in 18 months. The slowdown is being blamed on high raw material costs and official policies limiting the activity of organisations that use lots of energy.
Oxford Nanopore has made one of the UK's best ever market debuts as shares soared by more than 45% from their starting price. The genomics company, which makes rapid COVID-19 tests, is valued at around $6.75 billion and has sold over $700 million worth of shares in its IPO. Its listing is significant for the London Stock Exchange, as most British pharma companies choose to list in New York.
The car maker Opel has blamed a global chip shortage for the temporary closure of one of its German factories. The company says a shortage of semiconductors has caused an exceptional situation across the car industry, alongside scarcities of raw materials like plastic, steel and timber. Employees at the factory in Eisenach will be furloughed, with the plant expected to reopen next year.
A Los Angeles judge has ruled to suspend Britney Spears' father as her conservator, ending his decade-long control of the singer's life and money. The news has been met with cheers from her fans around the world. The court will have a final hearing to terminate Britney's arrangement altogether in November.
Now to an unprecedented move by Uber in Brussels, where the ride-sharing app joined with its drivers to protest against the government's failure to fulfill a promise to reform taxi regulations. Uber suspended its services for 3 hours in the Belgian capital on Thursday, the first ever temporary suspension of the app in Europe. This row relates to an outdated regulation from 1995 that bans drivers from using phones on the road. Brussels authorities invoked the legislation in March, meaning Uber drivers faced fines and even having their vehicles removed from the roads. The reforms were meant to be implemented before the end of the summer, but this has not happened. Well, Martin Willems is United Freelancers Secretary in Brussels. I asked him whether Uber and its drivers wanted the same things.
Probably not exactly. Both want that the Uber drivers are allowed to work and circulate and transport people. Now, we want it to be along the same rules. And naturally, in the first phase, Uber wanted just to disrupt the market and not to follow the rules. So you have a lot of differences. For instance, the Uber drivers are not taking the same insurance. They are not following the same health checks, and so on and so on. Also, they don't pay any license. So that's unfair competition. Also, there is the question of the employment status. A lot of Uber drivers, they want to be self-employed, and that's fine. But they should be treated as real self-employed, as independent people. And currently, in the Uber application, it's not possible to be independent because the Uber application is monopolizing any customer interaction, is fixing the prices, is evaluating the drivers, and so on and so on. So drivers want to work and they want to be really independent. Or if they are not independent, then to have the same rights as the workers.
Well, we should try and sort out this taxi issue, shouldn't we? Because the real problem in all cities is private cars, and that's the real issue here, isn't it? We should be trying to help public transport and help people into taxis and take them out of private cars.
Yes, I fully agree. I fully agree. It's a question of organizing transportation in our cities for the future. And certainly the city is making it more and more difficult for private cars. In London, there is a car toll. They are speaking about introducing a car toll here in Brussels also. But you have speed limits and so on. So private car is not a solution for the future. That's why we want to develop the public transportation, but also the taxi service. That's why I think there is a place for Uber-based services, but not at every cost. The platforms are welcome, and Uber drivers naturally have a place to have to work, but along the same rules as the taxi drivers. It's also a question of protection of the customer. You know, if a taxi driver, if he needs to have a license, if he needs to pass health checks, if you have regular technical checks of his car, it's also to protect the customer, to avoid accidents. So it should be the same rules for Uber drivers.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Keeping the lights on, China tries to resolve electricity shortages as several provinces suffer power cuts.
The EU's digital COVID certificate, which offers the promise of unlocking hassle-free travel around Europe this summer.
In less than 2 weeks' time, the Czech border will also open to all EU and Serbian citizens. 4.4 million Hungarians received their first dose of COVID vaccine.
18 and over can receive a COVID-19 vaccination, but it does come with conditions.
Third wave will probably take longer to emerge. This vaccination centre is part of a massive effort to try and drive down the numbers of the new variant that was first identified in India.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time is coming. This idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Awesome!
We hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN. Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Biden steps up to the plate to defend his presidency ahead of a midnight deadline to avert a government shutdown.
Final furlough. UK travel and hospitality sectors warn of tough times ahead as pandemic job protection comes to a close.
And youth climate activists pile the pressure on world leaders to act faster on tackling global warming.
China is trying to keep the lights on amid power outages. Coming just ahead of the winter, it's forced authorities to find solutions fast. But firing up more coal and gas-fired power stations is a delicate balancing act while trying to observe the country's climate goals. CGTN's Wang Se-wen has the story.
More than a dozen provinces announced some form of a power cut this month. Strong demand for coal on top of a shortage supply and the toughening emission standards have pushed the price of coal to record highs.
The price, as I know, that the per ton already reached to 1,600 yuan. That is already 3 times as normal.
Energy providers are not able to keep up. As demand increases, the price of coal isn't helping.
Both the demand and the supply, they have a gap, a big gap actually. In the first half year of 2021, we can see our electricity demand increased by 14%, but our production of electricity only increasing around 10%.
Many businesses are struggling to cope. The outages come as they are having to incorporate energy-saving measures and try to reduce their carbon emissions. This has had an inevitable knock-on effect on production. One factory in East China's Zhejiang province had seen its production levels halve, and it's not alone.
The stocking dyeing factory, which we cooperate with, is also in shutdown. Operations have been halted for 4 days and may last till the end of this month.
However, China's state grid has promised to meet people's basic energy needs, and the country's top economic planner, the NDRC, says it will guarantee home heating for the winter. China says it will be a carbon-neutral country by 2060 and is pushing reforms by promoting green and low-carbon energy. But how can it carry out these reforms and guarantee the growing energy demands at the same time?
The carbon emission is a national strategy. All entrepreneurs, all regions should pay great attention to support the national strategy, but not in a hurry step. That means all these measures will be done through a scientifically, a rationally, reasonably, and in good time period, to well planned, not in a hush, not in 1 second or 1 day, 1 night to overcome this carbon emission.
China's dual carbon goals are not easy to meet, but experts say getting over problems such as this energy crunch in a sustainable way can only smooth the way ahead. Wang Siwen, CGTN, Beijing.
Well, the fuel crisis in Britain and that power shortage story in China are part of a global supply chain crisis. There are growing fears about the risk of stagflation, the combination of weak growth and high inflation. A stark warning from some of the world's largest banks suggests the supply crisis could severely threaten global growth. Well, Mark Odswald is chief economist and global strategist with ADM Investor Services International. Mark, welcome. Global supply chains are under enormous pressure, that's clear. We're seeing a shortage of materials, we know about that, prices on the rise, energy crunches we've been reporting on in this programme. How did we get here? Is it just about the pandemic?
A lot of it's about the pandemic. I think, when we're talking about supply shortages, the things that we have most supply shortages of is people. And it's about the free movement of people. Because of the pandemic, eminently, there's been a lot of people you could normally draw on aren't available, because they're either in areas where there are restrictions, and in the UK's case, obviously, because there are additional restrictions due to Brexit. So it's as much about people as it is about the goods which aren't being moved because the people aren't available to move them.
Give us a bit of context. If you're as old as you or me, is this like the 70s?
No, it's slightly different to the 70s, because this is largely about the pandemic impact on what we have established as globalized supply chains, which rely on just-in-time production. And we were basically learning some very hard lessons about how fragile those supply chains actually are. And be that power or actually goods or raw materials. These are all basically dependent on everything running smoothly. And the moment that you've got something like the pandemic with its massive disruptions, suddenly it's effectively like throwing a pack of cards up in the air and you don't know which way they're going to land.
Are these just temporary headwinds that perhaps will blow themselves out given time, or are we in a seemingly never-ending crisis, and should we therefore be very worried?
We're not in a never-ending crisis, but they're not the things which can be resolved very easily, very quickly. One of the things which eminently has to happen is we need that freedom of movement of people so that people can fill those labour shortages on a demand basis as it was previously. But some of the other supply disruptions, we're transitioning to a greener form of energy production, and that in itself is basically a major, major challenge. And people who think that we can dump hydrocarbons, need to think again. There are a lot of very complex supply chains involved, and that needs to basically be managed much more carefully than the absolutist, let's get rid of all this hydrocarbon now, because it can't be done. Otherwise, we will have nasty consequences, above all in terms of, the biggest problem at the moment is you've got inflation in food, energy, and partially in goods, but I think that will disappear with time, and in housing. Those are all non-discretionary areas, and that's really where the biggest problem is, because at some stage, something's going to have to give on wages if this is going to last very long.
Central banks have been chucking enormous amounts of cheap money at the global economy for seemingly years, well, certainly the past decade or so, because they were worried about a repeat of the Great Depression in the 1930s. Despite all of that cash, we still haven't really seen a full recovery. Why is that? Did the economists get all that wrong?
Well, one thing that central banks, there's two things. One, central banks have basically encouraged a lot of asset price inflation when they were actually trying to create goods and services inflation, which were being negated the whole time by technology. Secondly, in the current situation, central banks can't create movement of people. Central banks can't create jobs. Central banks can't resolve power supply crises or indeed raw materials supplies. And they also can't make up for the fact that we've been underinvesting in all our grids around the world because this problem stretches all the way from China through Europe into North America and into South America. There's all things which they're powerless to influence. And it basically tells us that politicians have used the central bank monetary largesse to basically sit on their hands and not do nasty reforms or uncomfortable reforms, things which will be resisted, but things which need to be done. And that's really the crux point where we are. We're showing up the limits of what central banks can do and the fact that politicians actually need to put their hands in the fire, forget about the electoral cycle, and actually address some of the infrastructure problems that they've got in most of these countries.
So what is that magic wand? What is the one thing they should roll up their sleeves and do?
How about cooperation? Because the one thing that we've seen through the pandemic and with all the tensions that are rising between the West and China and Russia is that there's much less cooperation. And without that cooperation and with people objecting to helping each other, we're not actually going to get through this because we all need each other in all of this. And you know, that sort of confrontational aspect is actually only making the situation worse.
Mark Oswald in London, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Pleasure.
Another guilty verdict for Nicolas Sarkozy. A Paris court has convicted the former French president of illegally financing his 2012 re-election bid and sentenced him to 1 year of house arrest. Our correspondent Ross Cullen is in Paris. So Ross, tell us more.
Yeah, Robin, a historic verdict today. Nicolas Sarkozy being found guilty of illegal campaign financing, sentenced to 1 year in prison. That could be 1 year of house arrest. Eventually, with an electronic tag affixed to his ankle, Nicolas Sarkozy is appealing against the verdict. But this all relates to the 2012 re-election bid that he launched. He was president here from 2007 to 2012, tried to get a second term in office, ultimately lost that election to Francois Hollande. But he and his team spent more than $50 million on that re-election campaign. The legal limit, $27 million. What did they do? They masked the overspending, the court said, by drawing up fake bills with the help of a PR firm called Bigmalion. This trial was known as the Bigmalion trial due to the name of that PR consultancy. And Nicolas Sarkozy said that he did not know anything about these fake bills. He did not know anything about the overspending. He was focused on running his campaign. He denied the wrongdoing, but the judge said that, in fact, Nicolas Sarkozy willfully omitted in his role as a candidate from exercising control over his expenditure, and he was found guilty and sentenced to a year in prison. Not the only person on trial. His former deputy campaign chief, he'd already publicly acknowledged the fact that he was rerouting funds to try to camouflage these election costs. He got 3 years in jail, 2 of which are suspended, and 2 former executives as well from Bigmalion, that PR firm I was mentioning earlier. They also got prison sentences as a result of this trial today.
And Ross, this verdict for Sarkozy is on top of him also being convicted of corruption in a separate trial early this year.
Yeah, that's right, Robin, creating history, certainly not the history he'd like to be creating. Found guilty today of illegal campaign financing. Nicolas Sarkozy, if we dial ourselves back to March this year, found guilty of corruption and influence peddling over attempts to secure favours from a judge, allegedly offering him a plush place in Monaco. This judge, in return for providing Nicolas Sarkozy information on an investigation that was being carried out into the former president. So as a result of that, he got 3 years in jail, 2 of which are suspended, but he's appealing against that verdict. But Robin, despite all of this, these multiple investigations, trials, being found guilty, 2 different court proceedings this year, Nicolas Sarkozy remains an influential figure on the right of French politics. Many of the runners and riders that are starting to jockey on the right of the French political system, looking ahead to the April presidential election, trying to maybe have a tilt at unseating Emmanuel Macron. Many of those runners and riders are trying to win the ear of Nicolas Sarkozy. They look to him for guidance. They look to him for support. He is the most recent former French president from the centre-right of the political system. So despite all those investigations, he is somebody that a lot of people are looking to see who he is going to put his support behind for the presidential election. So Nicolas Sarkozy, as I said, found guilty in March of corruption, found guilty today of illegal campaign financing, and he is appealing against both verdicts.
Ross Cullen in Paris, thanks very much.
The pandemic has left few industries unscathed around the world. The international airline business has been grounded for months and taking time to take off again. China's aviation industry is slowly recovering from the pandemic and trying to achieve sustainable growth. We've been talking to the Chief Operating Officer of Airbus China.
All have been impacted by this pandemic for the last 18 months. But what we have noticed in China is a fast recovery of the domestic flights. Globally speaking, there is a trend for recovery. On the international flights, I think it will certainly take longer. And we are working now with the airlines and our partners to start defining what it would mean for the future.
The aviation industry is making global efforts to achieve carbon neutrality, such as by introducing carbon neutral flights. What efforts has Airbus made in this regard?
It is indeed a topic that we take very seriously. And first, we have decided to show full transparency on the global end-to-end carbon footprint of Airbus. I would say that first, let's talk about the aircraft usage itself. Short-term initiatives that we have done and that we continue to do is to try to optimize the efficiency of our aircraft. The next step will be to start introducing more and more use of sustainable aviation fuels.
Homegrown aircraft are taking centre stage as China continues to modernise its military and civilian fleet.
The AG-600, the world's largest amphibious aircraft, is the star attraction at an air show for the first time following a successful takeoff at sea last summer. CGTN's Huang Fei reports.
A plane that swims or boat that flies. This is AG-600, codenamed Kunlong, the soaring dragon. It's the world's largest amphibious aircraft, performing for the first time in Zhuhai. What you're seeing here is its firefighting superpower, scooping and dropping 9 tons of water in 3 seconds.
But it isn't just built to put out forest fires. It can fill gaps in maritime search and rescue for a country with a coastline stretching 18,000 kilometers. Kunlong can take off and land on rough seas with 2-meter-high waves. These suppression panels help keep water out of the engines, and floats on each side and a rudder at the tail all help keep the aircraft steady in motion. And the fisheye bowl up here is for rescuers to stick their heads into and look for survivors. Well, the plane is about the size of a Boeing 737 narrow-body jet, with room for 50 passengers on board. It can also move supplies between islands without airport facilities.
The AG-600 forms a powerful trio of China's large homegrown planes, along with the Y-20 strategic transport aircraft, the biggest plane on show here, and the C919 passenger jet, set for certification by the end of the year.
Kunlong is continuing tests in extreme conditions and is expected to be delivered by 2022. Huang Fei, CGTN at the Zhuhai Air Show.
DPRK leader Kim Jong-un says he is willing to restore a hotline with South Korea. The line was cut in August in protest over South Korea's annual joint military drills with the United States. Pyongyang has accused the US of continuing a hostile policy against his country and has condemned an American offer as a facade. Kim Jong-un suggested restarting communication after testing a new hypersonic missile.
A 96-year-old former Nazi concentration camp secretary who went on the run before her trial in Germany has been caught. Irmgard Kutschner is charged with assisting in the murder of over 10,000 people at the Stutthof camp in Poland. She reportedly left her care home in a taxi heading towards the metro station and absconded, missing the start of her court hearing. Kutschner, who will be tried in a juvenile court due to being 18 at the time, is the first woman in decades to stand trial over crimes connected to the Third Reich.
Ecuador's president has declared a state of emergency after a deadly prison riot. At least 116 people have been killed and 80 others injured. 6 people were reportedly beheaded. Authorities are calling it the worst penitentiary massacre in the country's history. Relatives of inmates gathered outside, demanding accountability from officials responsible for the inmates' safety.
Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid is in Bahrain to inaugurate his country's embassy. This is the highest-level official Israeli visit to the Gulf states since the two established diplomatic ties last year. Lapid will also hold talks with his counterpart to discuss cooperation in medicine, transportation and agriculture. Bahrain's Gulf Air also took off for its first-ever direct commercial flight to Tel Aviv.
Thursday marks China's National Martyrs' Day. President Xi Jinping and other senior officials have attended a ceremony to present flower baskets at the Monument to the People's Heroes in Tiananmen Square. Recipients of the July the 1st medal, the highest honour in the party, have also paid tribute to the fallen heroes, together with representatives from a wide cross-section of society. China introduced Martyrs' Day in 2014, and it's marked on September the 30th every year.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the British fishing communities who feel betrayed by Brexit as they try to navigate the rather choppy waters of export red tape.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. The European Commission says it'll ask the UK to explain why it's only issued limited numbers of licences for French boats to fish in British waters. Fishing rights have been a source of tension between the UK and France since Brexit.
The majority of British fishing communities voted to leave the European Union, only to find that red tape made it harder to export their catch to Europe. CGTN's Michael Voss has been to one of Britain's major fishing ports in Cornwall in southwest England to see how people there are coping.
Just before dawn at Newlyn Harbour, a local trawler starts unloading several tons of pilchards. Before Britain left the European Union, these fish would go straight onto refrigerated lorries and arrive within hours at local markets in France. With 80% of all the fish caught at Newlyn going for export, there were fears that all the extra red tape and costs could kill the industry. The problem made worse by COVID.
It has been a perfect storm. We were afraid of Brexit. That was going to cause us issues with our exports, and then COVID hit and saw a marked reduction in prices. But now we have seen the prices have recovered somewhat. That doesn't mean we're out of the water, out of the storm. But I would say we're on the up.
Fish sales started to recover after the local authority provided health inspectors to help with export certificates, though the process is slower and more expensive. One of the major selling points of Brexit was that it would limit access to foreign trawlers and increase quotas for local fishermen. In the end, only minor changes took place, phased in over 5 years. Skipper Paul Corrin voted for Brexit, Now he feels betrayed and has had to sell the family-owned trawler to keep the business alive.
The exports improved after Brexit with a lot of hard work from people, but the increase in quota that we were promised just didn't materialise. This was a family boat, but we had to sell to a bigger company. We just didn't have enough quota to keep the vessel running and make a profit.
So how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think we were all stabbed in the back. We were promised lots of stuff and it's not materialised and it's not going to materialise.
Boosting domestic sales is seen as another priority post-Brexit. Britain is an island nation surrounded by rich fishing waters. But apart from fish and chips, we don't eat much fish, and much of what we do is imported. A PR company was hired to rebrand some of the catches to make them more appealing. This Newlyn fishmonger also sells online, with the vast majority of his sales pre-Brexit going to export. Now Craig Tonkin believes the rebranding has helped.
So these used to be known as pilchards and now called Cornish sardines, and we sell a lot of those in the UK. This is a Megrim sole. 95% of these used to be sent to Spain, and now they've been rebranded as Cornish soles, and we sell a lot of those in the UK as well.
But for many Newlyn fishermen, exports remain their lifeblood. The worst of their problems may be over, but many are still struggling to survive. Michael Voss, CGTN, Cornwall.
A major cartoon and animation festival has opened in China, featuring original works from countries around the world.
And despite COVID restrictions, organisers say it's one of the best yet. CGTN's Gao Ang has the story.
The 6-day event covers a wide range of activities, such as an industry expo, forums, and cosplay shows. One of its aims is to drive China's cartoon and animation industry by creating a kind of special ecosystem for different players to meet, cooperate, and create. The big prizes of the festival, the Golden Monkey King Awards, honor the most influential animation works of the year. And it's not just domestic companies competing. There's also a rich international presence in the lineups. And despite COVID restrictions, there's a great appetite for discussion and some fun.
The difference between this year's festival and previous years is that due to the epidemic, there are special control measures. But the overall richness has been greatly improved, such as the interactive content of exhibitors, on-site discussions, and forums.
The festival has drawn many prominent sponsors, including China Media Group. Its theme is common prosperity and inspiring future generations. And there's plenty here to infuse youngsters.
Young people like anime very much. I hope the festival will be better and better.
Combining online and offline activities, the festival showcases new trends of Chinese animation, aiming to contribute to the industry's high-quality development and promote common prosperity. Gaoang, CGTN, Hangzhou, Zhejiang Province.
The headlines again. Biden steps up to the plate to defend his presidency ahead of a midnight deadline to avert a government shutdown.
Our other headlines: the final furlough, UK travel and hospitality sectors warn of tough times ahead as pandemic job protection comes to a close.
And youth climate activists pile the pressure on world leaders to act faster on tackling global warming.
And that's just about it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK on Preview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.